national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. The Venezuelan migration throughout Latin America and the Caribbean was sparked by rising political tensions in Venezuela in 2015. These tensions eventually resulted in the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. As the socioeconomic conditions deteriorated and were exacerbated by the 2017 US sanctions, the number of migrants fleeing Venezuela swelled to roughly 5 million in 2020. But what kind of welcome did these Venezuelan migrants receive in their host countries? Most of us have some idea of how they were received in Trinidad and Tobago, namely the 2-week migrant registration exercise at the end of May 2019 and its sister re-registration exercise currently underway. In Trinidad and Tobago, registered Venezuelan migrants are legally allowed to work and can access emergency health care. How does this Trinidad and Tobago welcome compare to that of other migrant-receiving countries within Latin America and the Caribbean? This is the central question that motivates our discussion this evening. On our panel this evening, we have Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, retired director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Shalene Gomes, and Dr. Buenjanat Tiwari, former Minister of Planning and former Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. So just a couple meeting announcements. Please ensure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking to prevent feedback. And please note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. This evening's conversation will proceed as follows. First, we'll begin with a presentation by Dr. Gonzalez, followed by contributions from Dr. Gomes, Dr. Hussein, and Dr. Tiwari. And last but not least, we'll invite questions and comments from you, our audience, either verbally or using the Zoom chat box. Thank you. Next, I invite Dr. Gonzalez to begin his contribution. Dr. Gonzalez?
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. And let me thank you and Rebecca and Roger for inviting me once again to do a presentation. This evening, I want to talk about the integration of Venezuelans into the society of Trinidad and Tobago.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Gonzalez, but would you be able to use the presentation view?
Yes. Are you seeing the presentation?
We're seeing it, but we would like to see it in presentation view. If you go to the bottom bar on your screen, to the middle, you will see right next, you'll see a negative sign. Immediately to the left of the negative sign.
Bottom of my screen?
Bottom of your screen, the bottom right side of your screen in general, you'll see a positive and a negative sign. Yes.
I'm a little lost here.
Okay. So
what are you seeing right now? You're seeing part of it?
No, we just want you to enlarge it. There's a way that you can enlarge it, but we just want you to move your cursor to the bottom of your screen.
I went
all the way to the bottom.
I'm not seeing anything here.
To the right, you'll see a positive sign and a negative sign on the bar. No.
Bottom of my screen, there's nothing there. It's not.
Okay, so just a minor
challenge. What could I try? I could go out and try to
no, don't go out. I think this, yeah. Okay, well, we will work with it as is for the time being. Okay.
All right. Well, let's continue, right? Okay.
Yes.
So, as I said, I want to look at the integration of Venezuelan migrants into Trinidad and Tobago, and I decided that I would try to compare this with what is happening in the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America. so that I'm trying to look at the influx of Venezuelan refugees and migrants over the last 5 years, which has raised several concerns about their integration into the society. Given the challenges that such integration pose in this small country, it is fitting to examine the state of play of this integration with a view to distilling what has been achieved and what has not been achieved. And to do that, I approached it, first of all, by looking at a piece done by Aga and Strand, and they try to conceptualize this whole question of integration. And they developed a framework. I have the reference there. You can probably see it, Understanding Integration, a Conceptual Framework, the Journal of Refugee Studies, volume number 21. And they started out by defining integration as being something very problematic and controversial. They found that there was no one acceptable definition of integration. They found about 49 different definitions. And what they decided was to try and explore what they call an operational definition. That is to say, they tried to define success in integration as something related to what they call domains. Domains were essentially what they call, and I'll define this further as we go along, they call markers and means, social connection, facilitators, and foundation. Within these domains, within these 4 domains, you had what you might call teams. For instance, markers and means, you would have sectors like employment, housing, education, and health. These were the 4 they concentrated on. And as I said, pointed out, there could be other markers. You know, other situations may require you to add certain things. I'll come back to that in a short while. They also talk about social connection, which has to do with the ways of social connection within and between groups in the community. They then talked about facilitators, another domain where you had teams dealing with language, cultural knowledge, and the local environment. And then you finally had what they call foundation, which dealt with the values and assumptions and practice regarding citizenship and rights. Foundation was key to it, as we shall see later on as I discuss this further. You can just know that in that definition, they're not concerned with causes. They're not concerned with what are the factors determining integration, emotional factors, political factors, and so on. They're basically dealing with what they consider to be the commonalities among groups as to what they define as being successful integration. Now you'll see here in the table that I put up, I outlined them. You'll see work, housing, education, and health under markers and means. Then you have social connections will be social bridges. I shall define this further as I go along. Social bonds, social links. Then you have facilitators will be language, culture, safety, and stability. And then foundation will be rights and responsibilities. I've added, for instance, food security here. And as I mentioned earlier, in each context, you need to look at it and see, for example, what may be left out. In a particular context, you may not need certain things. For instance, when I started looking at this, I found that this was generally used for established migrant communities in the UK and in other countries and so forth. It wasn't very suited to recent migrant communities, migrants that are now coming in. And there I found, for instance, that for migrants who are now coming in, food security is a major issue. You have others like legal services because of the exploitation and all of that. You find that these are issues which probably require more attention. You may find, for example, under facilitators, you may find ICT. ICT may be a very important facilitator in certain contexts. But anyway, they use these domains to build a framework, and they try to build a framework based on the understandings of successful integration, which form the sort of normative basis for analyzing integration in specific migrant settings. They verify the whole framework by consulting a number of potential users, both at the policy and practice level, as well as they triangulated the literary reviews, the documentary analysis, the qualitative work, as well as the cross-sectional surveys. They then went on to look at measurement, and measurement is essentially indicators. What are the successful indicators of integration? They try to determine what are them. The literature is filled with all different types of indicators, depending on where you study something and what you try specifically to examine. You can take specific areas, for example, employment, and try to examine that alone, or you could take the entire whole. So you could bite off, you could choose basically what you think you need to look at. But indicators range across things like percentage employed, the level of health to which you have access to, and a whole range of things. There's so many that it's impossible to really go them through. I tended to use indicators on a kind of judgmental basis. And you would find, for instance, that in some cases you have to do some kind of ranking of the status of people. For instance, in foundation, the migratory status is a very important thing. And you have to try to find out what is the migratory status, how do you rank, for example, something from an entry permit towards citizenship, and all the stations in between. How do you rank these things in order to be able to compare countries? So I looked at that, and I'll come back to that later on. And then finally, I looked at several studies. I gathered about 6 major surveys that were done on Latin America and the Caribbean, largely by UNHCR, and there were others like the World Food Program and other research bodies. And these surveys were more or less comparable. The data was more or less comparable, so I found that it was useful to look at them, and I shall draw on them to some extent to pull out the indicators and make certain comparisons. Now, each team can be measured on a Likert scale from 1 to 5, and to give you some kind of overall measure of integration. After you've gone through all the domains, all the various domains, and you measure them, you could put on them on some kind of Likert scale. You could say, for example, over 80% could be considered as 5, and so on and so forth. And in that way, you can come up with some overall measure or average measure of performance in the particular team and in the particular domain. And then you could get overall, if you have done all 4 domains, you could come up with some overall average of performance. Now, I haven't done that, but my aim is to try to get there, but I'm just mentioning it now as an approach to trying to handle this. Now, each domain and team has the same weight, and this is one of the weaknesses of this exercise, because if you weigh the domains differently, if you weigh the teams differently, there's a certain kind of relative importance of each domain that you could capture, and I think certainly the results would be certainly more significant. I say this because, for instance, foundation is a critical thing. It has to do with the rights, the nationhood, the citizenship of a country, and that foundation, in a sense, more or less sets the stage for what migrants may be able to achieve in a society. So I tend to feel that, for instance, one needs to weigh that much more. But I'm not doing that in this exercise. I'm just doing more or less a descriptive thing at this particular point in time. Now, turning to foundation, we find that there are different approaches to nationhood and citizenship, as well as granting migrants rights and calling for obligations from them. Some authors tend to think that there are basically 4 models of citizenship: an imperial one, an ethnic one, a republican one, and a multicultural one. An imperial one would be more or less categorized by subjection. Like neo colonial days, we got British citizenship because we were subjected. Then you have the ethno-national one, which has to do with blood ties. Then you have political participation, which is more or less the Republican one. And then you have the multicultural one, which we are familiar with, more or less like Canada, to some extent Trinidad and Tobago. The multicultural one and the ethno-national one are more or less dominant models in Western society. And these are models that can shift over time. For instance, if we look at the United States today, you'll see where the United States, some years ago, has been aspiring to be a kind of multicultural society. But we see today, for example, that there's a rise in ethno-nationalism, which means that America could be heading to somewhere like Germany. Germany, as you know, is a very strong ethno-nationalist country. If you go back in history, we saw the period of the 40s and so on, all where that came from. And it took years, for instance, I can't remember, but there were migrants in Germany from the after the war, some of them particularly from the 60s up to the end of the century, up to 2010. And I believe it's only about a few years ago that these Turkish migrants have been able to get nationality. You know, that ethno-nationalism refused to give them nationality because as far as they were concerned, they are not German, right? In multicultural societies, it's a bit different, and we shall come back to discuss that. So why I'm raising that is because that question of identity, and I believe Mr. Richard Lynch had raised this question on a previous occasion on this very discussion. But how do we see ourselves in terms of approaching migrants? Are we an ethno-nationalist state or are we a multicultural state? And you know, in that context, how do we approach giving nationality to foreigners? Now, it's hard to define any of these Latin American or Caribbean countries as ethno-nationalist states. At the same time, they're not all pluralist states of the same ilk. That is, there are a lot of variation that takes place among them, and they have a lot of different notions about citizenship and nationality. So you will see, for instance, on this chart that I'm presenting here, you would find that if you look at the various things, for instance, if you look at the granting of visas, or for instance, the requirement of a visa to enter the country, you'd find, I looked at Trinidad and Tobago, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Guyana, Colombia, Chile, Aruba, and Curacao. You'd find all of these countries require a visa today for Venezuela. It wasn't so some years ago. We changed in 2019. Before that, we used to have, it was visa free. Guyana is the only one that doesn't require a visa. Right? It gives you a 3-month entry that you could come in and then you could renew this. When you come into Trinidad, you get a temporary stay permit. And these temporary stay permits are widely used in Latin America, in all of these countries. In most cases, it's 1 year or 2 years. In places like Peru and Chile, it's 2 years. And recently, it was like that in Colombia up to a few weeks ago, and then it has now been changed to 10 years, right? I also want to point out that the first country to offer a pathway to citizenship is really Colombia. None of the other countries so far has offered any pathway to citizenship. As a matter of fact, if we follow this issue, we would see where even in the United States today, they can't offer a pathway to citizenship to people, for instance, dreamers who have been there for over 40 years. They have become mature, they don't know any other country, they can't even be offered a pathway to citizenship. But there are just 2 other things I want to mention, and that is the 2 Convention on the Status of Refugees, the 1951 Convention and the Protocol of 1967. I just want us to note here that Guyana is not a member of this. Neither is Aruba and Curacao. Aruba and Curacao has a certain amount of autonomy from the Netherlands, and they have chosen not to be members of that. All the other countries are members of that. Trinidad and Tobago are members of these 2 conventions. I point this out because that may be important in terms of considering rights and protection that we grant to refugees or migrants and so on. Let me just point out some nuances in this whole thing. Latin American countries created their own template for receiving migrants. And they eschewed the idea of granting refugee status in favor of treating the recent arrivals as migrants. Now, you would recall that this was a discussion here when we were told that we're supposed to offer refugee status to these migrants, and we said, no, all of them are not refugees, they are migrants. Well, very early in the game, the Latin American countries decided to go against that. All of them did it except today, which are Costa Rica, Brazil, Argentina, and there are 1 or 2 others. But the vast majority of them questioned this idea of refugee status and decided that you have to come and then they're going to treat you as a migrant. They're not going to treat you as a refugee. So Trinidad and Tobago was not alone in doing that. The question that most of us are concerned with is that this kind of irregular status, the granting of, let's say, 3 months or 6 months or a year, it leads to a lot of irregular migration. You'd find, for example, that in Trinidad at present, irregular migration is about 19%. In Colombia, just before it introduced these new measures, it was 56%. And you'd find that there are high levels of irregular migration in all the other countries, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and all of them. It's considerably high. And most of the people tend to feel it's a way associated with this whole idea of a temporary status. Now, what is the legal status of which country has the best legal status? Does Trinidad has a better legal status, migratory status than the others? On this question, I would say that Trinidad is not really at the bottom, but it is somewhere close to Peru and Chile. It offers this 6 months stay. That, as I said earlier, tend to encourage irregular migration. And people to some extent believe that, okay, there's no future here and so on. So they tend to stay illegally. They tend to believe that, all right, well, we'll see how far this goes and then they move on. And one of the reasons Colombia moved to that 10-year status and a part of citizenship is because Colombia is preparing for the long haul. I think they see that Venezuela is going to be in that state for a long time, and they need to start finding a way to integrate all these Venezuelans properly into the country. And it will, to some extent, reduce the amount of illegal migration in the country. So that's how I would say with respect to this question of migratory status. As I say, it has a lot to do with the nature of citizenship in the country, how we see ourselves, our identity, and so forth. And generally, it's very difficult to compare countries on something like this. Let me turn quickly to social connection. Social connection, which has to deal with social bonds, social bridges, social links. Social bonds refer to the co-ethnic relationship, family, and religious connections, and so on. Social bridges has to do with bridges with other communities. So if you're in Trinidad, if you link to other communities in Trinidad, and social links, social links has to do with your relationship with the state. Now, it has been found that in Colombia and Ecuador, social links are very thin, as the majority of respondents see migrants begging on the street. While in Peru, there's a much greater kind of interaction, because I think they operate a lot in the informal sector in Peru. Peru has a huge informal sector, and there's a high degree of interaction in the markets. So that you'd find that in countries outside of Peru, you'll find there's very little meeting in the workplace. Very few meet with, see Venezuelan children in the schools. Venezuela meet Venezuelan migrants in the workplace. And in those results, you'd find that these connections are pretty weak. Sorry, I think yeah. Yes. Now, in Colombia, for instance, you'd find that 34%, I think, share the workplace with Venezuelans. 32% live close to Venezuelans. And about 35% of the children attend school with Venezuelans. I don't know what the percentages are for a place like Trinidad and Tobago. My suspicion is that there's a fair amount of interaction in Trinidad and Tobago, because the country is small, the markets are very interactive here, and there's probably a place where we would meet Venezuelans a lot. I suspect that Venezuelans don't have too much difficulty in reaching out and bridging and making links with the rest of the community, but where they sorry, let me just reverse that. I think they have that may be an area of some difficulty. Whereas in terms of social bonding, that is links among themselves, the creation of networks among themselves, they may be doing pretty well. So there may not be too many difficulties there. I would say it's difficult to make a conclusion on this. I would say that we need to do some further work, and I hope to get back to that at some later point. The facilitators' language and cultural knowledge are identified as key areas of competence. and they are perceived as necessary to integrate the Venezuelans into the wider community. Being able to speak the language of the host is central to any integration process. Safety and stability are common themes emerging in all of the interviews. Refugees felt at home in their localities if they were peaceful, while non-refugees were also concerned that the new arrival migrants did not cause unrest in the community. So a sense of personal safety was quite paramount. Moving on, we find that Venezuelans in Trinidad are faced with barriers of language. There's no need for me to emphasize that. We all can know that. And there's a lack of recognition of their professional certificates and diplomas. So that's a problem. There's also a fair amount, and I should say a fair amount, but a sizable amount of labor and sexual exploitation, stigma and xenophobia also exist, which are main obstacles and barriers to integration. 70% of the Venezuelans in Trinidad tended to respond to feelings of discrimination against them, and they attributed that to their nationality. Now, leaving social connection, and turning to the markers. In unemployment, here I wasn't able to get adequate amount of data. I think what is important to note is that 68% of the unemployed Venezuelans here that responded to the survey lost their jobs, or those who are unemployed said they lost their jobs due to the pandemic. So the pandemic has played a critical role in terms of their plight. And we'll come back to that in a little while. I'm moving pretty fast because I see the time is going and I have a few more slides to complete. So employment is a difficult area. I think before the pandemic, they were not doing too badly. But when the pandemic hit, apparently a lot of them have been affected as a result. Housing is not a bad area. For instance, you would find that 98% of the Venezuelans here, they rent rooms, apartments, or houses. And this compares with about 70% in Colombia, Peru, and Chile. You'd find that in those countries, in the latter countries, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, a lot of them are hosted by family and friends, large percent. And you'll find, for example, in a place like Colombia, 79% of them live with immediate family. And this has to do with the family connection between Colombia and Venezuela. But the point we should note here is that a significant amount of respondents in Colombia, Peru, and Chile, they regarded themselves as being homeless. That is, they lived on a beach or they lived on the street. And that percentage, by the way, for the recent arrivals, those that came just over the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, that percentage increased to 15% that are living on the street. This is a vast difference between a difference with Trinidad, because I haven't been able to detect any Venezuelans living on the street in Trinidad. This is the data from the surveys done. I haven't seen any reflection of that. Moving on, looking at another area, another theme, health, for instance, very important marker. We have discussed a lot of that in the media, as well as as we have seen in various studies. We find that in Trinidad and Tobago, there's access to primary and emergency health, including support for infant and young child feeding, and there's growing monitoring and immunization of children under 5 years old. That is granted to all. Yet there's a limited access to these services for refugees, migrants, and other non-national groups due to the issues of lack of knowledge of where to go, long waiting lines, being denied services, and the quality of customer assistance. We find that 70% of the Venezuelans in Trinidad say that they have access to medical services since COVID. And there's limited access to public health services, despite some countries in the sub-region, for example, the Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Jamaica, extend basic public services such as primary health to Venezuelans inside the country. And I think we do that. I think we allow them to go to the public hospitals or the healthcare centers. community healthcare centers to get some access to primary care. So access to primary care is there, but it's to some extent hampered due to probably legislation. I think if you are still an undocumented refugee, you will still have problems. If you register and you get a permit, you would have access to that particular facility. In Guyana and the Dominican Republic, all Venezuelans can access primary health care. Yet secondary and tertiary health services are limited due to limited funding, infrastructure, resources, and human capacity. And I believe that is more or less the situation here. Secondary healthcare is something, and tertiary healthcare, which is, you know, a much more sophisticated level, that is not really readily accessible to them. There are several obstacles to healthcare, and we could spend a lot of time later looking at that. A lot of have to do with the language barriers, the facilities available, etc. I wouldn't go into that. But I would conclude by saying that there's probably no discernible difference between what Trinidad and the rest of the 4 other Caribbean countries do. Let me say I'm comparing Trinidad with Guyana, Dominican Republic, Curacao, and Aruba, because these countries operate together with Trinidad in a UNHCR sub-regional program. And these are where most of Venezuelans have gone to the Caribbean. Where I get data, I'm able to include some Latin American countries, in particular Colombia, Peru, and Chile, where I found studies that are comparable. Now, a major issue is another marker is food security. Now, 88% of the respondents in Colombia, Peru, and Chile said they consume 2 or more meals during the day. And this compares more or less to about 93% in Trinidad, or almost 100%, I think, in Trinidad. I think there's some problem of the figures here. About 93% in Trinidad. 6 out of 10 Venezuelan migrants in Colombia are worried about not having enough food to eat. And these results in 2020 were more or less in line with what was there in 2019. Colombia observed an increase in the preoccupation with regards to food. The percentage moved from 65% to 69%, and we can see here that COVID worsened the situation. In terms of food consumption, both Ecuador and Peru observed a decrease in food security. That is to say, there's a growing insecurity in these countries with respect to food. And Trinidad and Tobago, though not in that same situation, is still, however, shares some concern about a worsening food situation. The recent survey done in December by the UNHCR, by the Iom, also highlights that because it points to the fact that Venezuelans, many more Venezuelans, I think it was about 31%, referred to the worsening food situation. Now, just a word quickly about the needs to give an overall picture before I conclude. There are a lot of priorities that migrants point out. The first, for instance, in Trinidad, you'll find jobs that have probably the highest priority, followed by food, which is 51%, followed by housing, followed by legal services, followed by medical services, and then education. Since COVID, we find that there are some other things that have been added to that. So for instance, like the quality of food, insecurity and violence, discrimination and exploitation, as well as access to water and sanitation. So that to make an overall conclusion, and not to take up too much time, I think I more or less decided to take about half an hour, and I want to confine myself to that and have some discussion. I would say that on the question of foundation, that is the migratory status, I would say Trinidad and Tobago is lagging somewhat with its 6-month temporary status. As I said, most of the other countries, if not all of them, are for at least 2 years, with Colombia being the gold standard. I think we have to look at this as trying to, if we want to regularize the situation. I saw where recently we renewed the permit for another 6 months, and I wasn't sure what was happening, how many of them were turning up, but my impression is that a lot of them may not be really all that keen about going back for another 6 months, and they see no difference between that and an illegal status. So from my prediction, based on what I'm seeing, you might get a lot more of them going in the illegal channel. On social connection, as I said, it is very difficult to measure, but I suspect that They're not doing too badly with respect to social links and social bonding among themselves. Bridges to the rest of the community are frustrated due to largely language and the absence of cultural knowledge about this country. These are some things that one would have to work with over time. And let me point out that we are talking here basically about migrants that have come in the last 3 years. These are not settled communities. These are very unsettled communities. They've just come here and they're going back and forth. So we have a lot of work to do to see how this evolves. The barriers to the facilitators of language and culture, we are not doing too badly. I think there's some insecurity, or at least we do not have the insecurity and violence that I've observed in some of the Latin American countries. In some cases, you find that some communities itself are unstable. Some border communities are very unstable with violence and so on, and they can't settle easily in these communities. We don't have that problem in Trinidad, so there's a fair degree of safety there in terms of settlement in certain communities. With respect to the markers, and I shall conclude on that, housing and food security seem to stand out among our markers as compared to the other countries. Trinidad and Tobago, with respect to the other markers, are more or less on par with respect to education and employment and health. The COVID is slightly changing that situation, so that we have to watch it and see to what extent we could be losing ground. But more or less, I would say, with respect to employment, health and education and so forth, we are more or less on par with the other countries. I haven't been able to detect any major difference. So I will conclude on this point, and I will be glad to answer any questions as the discussion unfolds. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. And next, I'd like to invite Dr. Gomes to give her contribution. Dr. Gomes.
Hi, thanks. Afternoon, evening, I should say. I was keeping my video off to make sure I didn't have any internet problems to try to minimize it. So it's lovely to meet everyone. It's lovely to see everyone. Thanks so much, Professor Gonzalez, for those very detailed and thorough markers and means for me, to use a pun, to consider. What I'd like to ask you to do, Chair, please, is to keep me on a time check, because what I would like to do is think about some of these domains of integration through a vignette of migrant survival. Because of my disciplinary training in social anthropology, I teach the sociology of culture, and I've also done ethnographic fieldwork in East Africa, specifically in Ethiopia. What I tend to do is I go from the micro and the meso, and I build up to the macro. And so whether we are thinking about integration in terms of early to mid 20th century structural functionalist theories of mechanical solidarity or organic solidarity, or whether we're thinking about it more in terms of post-colonial and postmodern theories about multiculturalism and multicultural citizenship, as Professor Gonzalez has mentioned, what I would like to do is offer some excerpts from a vignette of a migrant Venezuelan man whom a postgraduate student and I had written about through a narrative ethnography. And this was a really short post that we had up on the Sociological Review blog. And what we did was we asked him to talk about his experiences surviving. And so we said, rather than thinking about migration in terms of trying to better oneself and to achieve betterment, we talked about a narrative of survival. And so thinking about that narrative of survival can be broken down into thinking about these means and markers of work, of health, of education, of housing. So some of these certainly of basic needs, as well as thinking about social bonds, or as Durkheim would have said a century ago, of social cohesion, of a kind of organic solidarity that could develop. And so some of the things that this Venezuelan migrant had said to us can also be thought about in terms of structures, as Professor Gonzalez mentioned. So the structures that determine, that shape regimes of mobility and immobility, that shape the decisions that people make, as well as the ideas and the symbols of belonging. So certainly thinking about both systems and the more individual and the more idiosyncratic experiences that he had. So what Ernesto, as we called him, this was a pseudonym that we used. What Ernesto had said to us was that this was his movement to Trinidad was, and it was by boat, it was simply about surviving. It was about making sure that his wife, his child, he had a young daughter at the time, could live. And so his primary concern was about filling those basic needs. He and his wife, his daughter, his brother, as well as his brother's wife, had come at different times in 2018 by boat from Venezuela to Trinidad. And what he had said to us was that first, he managed to find housing because of the networks of people that he had there. So he found himself in a particularly vulnerable situation. It wasn't very clear what type of work he did before, but he found himself in a more vulnerable situation in Trinidad precisely because he came as an undocumented person, right? He came as an undocumented migrant. And so this was something that that was very new to him, this status. And so he was particularly vulnerable to the sorts of official policies, as well as to, for example, persons who were renting to landlords who were able to charge excessively high rents, right? Which he had to pay because he was trying to fulfill his basic needs. So he was focused on his basic needs: shelter, food, and then of course, safety and security. And so what he also explained to us was that through the networks of other Venezuelan migrants he was able to fulfill this basic need for shelter. So that was covered. Although he had to pay an exorbitant rent, he eventually found a landlord who was really kind, as he said, or amable. He was able to find odd jobs. He wasn't able to find the kind of sustained employment that he had had before, although he wasn't very specific about what kinds of work he did. But it was quite clear that he was used to having a stable income, right? As compared in Venezuela, as compared to Trinidad. And so he had gotten housing covered. Food was a challenge because he had to find and walk around looking for odd jobs. He eventually found a stable job in construction, right? And that also was very new to him. He did not want to disclose whether he had registered or not for work. And so that presented an additional layer of uncertainty, right, and anxiety for him as he was walking around initially looking for work. So the kinds of experiences that Ernesto described were those that were shared with many other migrants, not all, and not only those from Venezuela, but in particular, those migrants who were very vulnerable. And so this leads me to another point that I wanted to make before I go on to the social bonds, before I go on to the language and culture. And that point is about the regimes of mobility and immobility and how they structure the experiences of these types or two types of migrations. So you have those who come by boat and those who take the risk right, to do this very short but very perilous journey between Venezuela and Trinidad. And you have those who come by air who are able to get visas now that they have to apply for visas, and who are able to cover basic needs and to think about betterment. So these two trajectories and these two types of migration are also things that I think help us to merge the structure, the kinds of structures that Professor Gonzalez was talking about, as well as individual experiences and needs and aspirations and goals. And so if I'm thinking about social bonds, to go back to Ernesto's story, one of the things that he also said to us was that walking around, initially he had settled in East Trinidad, and it was in an urban neighborhood. And so it was a well-developed urban neighborhood. Walking around, he also got a lot of anti-migrant and a lot of xenophobic tinged remarks made to him on the street. He was, of course, that enhanced his anxiety, but he kept going. What he found then, after a year or more of living there, was that, and also this helped when he found consistent work in construction, was that people, of course, familiarity led to the building of social bonds. So even though at a macro level, he was still, we don't know if he was registered or not, but he was still undocumented. He was able to find stable work. He had covered his basic needs. He was building these social relationships with people. And he started to feel more at home, quote unquote, right? And so this didn't mean, of course, that he wasn't still anxious and scared and uncertain, but you can see the ways in which, through the example of this particular person, he became more integrated in this community or in this particular neighborhood. To go very briefly to language, and then I want to go to the culture nationhood point. To briefly about language is that also he had to learn English, right? So it's not as though he wasn't he didn't know any English at all, but over time his English language skills also improved, right? And so that helped. So finally, to think about, and of course his daughter it would be much easier for her to learn English as well. I don't know to what extent people were learning Spanish or not, but finally, to think about integration in terms of cultural integration, one of the things that I would like to point out to end with is also this importance of the state structures and the institutions that foster integration, but also ideas of nationhood. And so Trinidad and Tobago thinks of itself as an anglicized, right, post-colonial nation. So despite a history of multicultural Amerindian inhabitants, pre-conquest, Spanish occupation and colonialism, a French plantocracy. And so simple things like speaking Spanish marks you as different, right, from this anglicized post-colonial nation. And so this is also one of the things that is particularly interesting for us to consider when we're thinking about how to merge the structures with the ideas and the experiences. Because with this very diverse history, there is a particular post-colonial model of nationhood that we very much promote, right? And for us to think about us meaning people who live here, right? Who also have parents who are migrants and ancestors, obviously. But for people who live here, to think about to what extent we are reproducing a kind of narrow understanding of integration and belonging. So I'm going to end here, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Gomez. Next, we'd just like to invite Dr. Hussein to give his contribution. Dr. Hussein?
Yes, thank you very much. I would First, I'd like to start off by congratulating the two speakers before me for excellent presentation. I learned a lot from both of them. I didn't know Shelleen had that vast experience in East Africa as well, but excellent presentations. Professor Gonzalez, before I actually shoot off, I only have two questions, but I wanted to know the source of most of your data. I somehow missed the source of the data. Can you just for remind me of the source of the data, where you compared Colombia and how much meals the migrants got as compared to Trinidad? Are you all hearing me?
Yeah,
Yes, we're hearing you.
I'm hearing you.
Okay.
Yes, Roger, I'm hearing you. I have 6 surveys that I use. I can probably even put them up on the screen for a little while if you want, or I can send them to you. They're all surveys done by UNHCR on the World Food Program. And I use them because they were comparable. And that's the data that I presented a while
Okay,
ago.
excellent. No, really good data. I sent to you all yesterday the, I think it's IOM, the latest IOM survey.
Yes.
So maybe that may be a little useful as well.
Yes, I use that. I read it last night and I used it. Yes, it's an update from what they have done before in 2019 and something earlier that they did last year as well. Yes, I use that.
So in the context of that, just 2 comments I have. One of the things that really concerns me is this re-registration exercise or lack of full registration. And we brought it up before. I heard the 2 speakers made their presentation, and even more now, having heard Dr. Gonzalez and Shelleen speak, is the whole issue of should we be registering all 60,000 of the Venezuelan migrants that are here, and the 60,000, we raised that number before, or should we just focus on the registered 15,525, which to me leaves 3/4 of the migrants undocumented and therefore does not change our understanding of how to integrate this block of workers into the economy. And I liked when the point was raised of the volatility that the 3-month to 6-month period brings. Because if you only give 6 months period, then you can only plan within a range of economic activity. For example, and I'm guessing here, supposing purpose are 9-month crops, and you need why migrant laborers to help you with the 9-month crop. But all you are getting is these 6-month episodes. Then if I were a farmer, I would be worried. I would say, well, Lord, if I plant all this pawpaw, then I may have to go in the field and sit down and eat them myself when it's time to bring them out. So it is something that we would have to look at. And secondly is the coordination, the one-to-one mapping of skills with gaps. Now, it has me confused because this is an economy that is in dire and urgent need of factor boom. So here it is, we have a factor boom. And to capitalize or to fully integrate and benefit from the shifts in the supply curve at the aggregate level that could occur because of these 60,000 migrant workers, we need information. Now, if you don't have information, what would happen is you would end up with basically 60,000 unskilled workers. The information allows a fragmentation of the workers into different groups. And if I may for simplicity, break it into skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled. So it gives you the opportunity to change the interactions within the production function by now having almost 3 distinct factors of production as compared to 1 factor of production if you don't document them properly. Because generally they would all end up in unskilled working areas. And whilst I would not belabor the point here, I have had long discussions with Professor Gonzalez that if they are undocumented, and the literature clearly points in this direction elsewhere in the world, undocumented migrants end up working in the informal, non-tradable sector. The last place in the world, or the last place that we need people to work in Trinidad, is in the informal, non-tradable sector, because our current account balance, non-energy current account balance, in my opinion, is in a mess. And for you to have an economy that has crashed basically since 2009, and I often quote the statistics that we have produced about 4.3 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, and yet still our average annual growth rate between 2009 and 2020 is minus 1%. So in that type of economy, I don't know that you have room to play roaming. I think you have to be very well aware of all the cards and reduce information asymmetry. And that would help with the integration that Professor Gonzalez had elaborated on earlier in his presentation. The other point I would raise is one from a narrow economic point of view. I have been looking at the productivity of workers in Trinidad and Tobago. And one place that we could use the Venezuelan worker if we were to go towards work permit arrangement is in the agricultural sector. But then, Prof, when you look at the data, you see that output per worker in the agricultural sector is about 17%, if I remember the number correctly, of that of the manufacturing sector. So we make all these strong arguments, we fight for them to enter into the production function in a symmetric way, and then we realize that one of the key areas where they can add value has a low output per worker. So in order to facilitate these migrant workers, we need to think about the sectors in which we would like them to go and how to increase output per worker in those sectors as well. And this brings us directly back to the ease of doing business, which is mind-boggling to me. That, you know, I had a glimpse of the conversation of the Minister of Finance last night, and our economy is struggling. It is struggling, and here it is, one endogenous factor, the ease of doing business that could unleash domestic capital and probably even attract foreign capital that is endogenous and therefore mainly at the influence of our domestic policymaker is moving backwards. How do we explain that to the next generation whilst we are the gatekeepers of the economy now? How do we, what will we say to them when underneath our watch they point out to us that, well, and Marlon is my good friend, I will say, well, Marlon, how come underneath your watch the ease of doing business went so much backward? Why are we not fixing it? I mean, it's the endogenous factor, and it's very, very closely linked to the migration strategy, because to integrate the migrants and to benefit from enhanced output per worker, you need to unleash domestic capital that could absorb the skilled, unskilled, and semi-skilled labor, and therefore give you the right type of strategic output. So mine is more of a comment rather than questions to the panelists. Maybe they may or may not respond to it, but that's where I think some thought has to go in terms of alignment of factor endowment and commodity output, and proper alignment in terms of entitlement and capabilities in that regard. So thank you for the opportunity to say that.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Hussein. Next, I'd just like to bring Dr. Tiwari into the conversation. Dr. Tiwari? Dr. Tiwari, we'll just need you to unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. I too want to congratulate Professor Gonzalez for his very clear presentation on his comparative analysis of what was happening in a number of countries in the region with regard to migration. And secondly, Dr. Gomes for her very different perspective having to do with the story of one migrant and focusing on the issue of survival, and then making the distinction between survival groups who come here and betterment groups who come here for opportunity. And I thought that the two presentations really sort of complemented each other well, despite their contrasting perspectives. And I too benefited a lot from it. I don't have too many issues by way of questions because I'm reflecting really on the presentations. But one of the things that came up in my mind is how important is economic viability of the host country, and therefore the economic conditions during a migration from another country that is pretty heavy. How important is the economic viability of the host country for, what can I say, for absorbing the migrants and creating the conditions for integration? So I will just put that out as a short, simple question. And the reason is, of course, because you have a situation where prior to March 2020, the migrants were coming, but during the COVID period, when the economic situation is pretty bad, and we've had going on 6 years now of economic decline, how do these factors existing in the host country affect the migration? Because I didn't get any of that nuance in the presentations. Except for the statement by Professor Gonzalez that a lot of people, migrants, had lost jobs during the COVID period. The second thing is, how does the fact that we are in an economically stressful situation affect the disposition of the host population in terms of receptivity to the migrants? I don't know if there has been any thinking on that, or if there is any literature to be drawn on by either of the speakers tonight on that, and whether they could share some of that with us. And so that would be the second question. And the third thing, and I will leave it there, I won't contribute afterwards except to listen to any responses or points of view, is to what extent do we have a system in Trinidad and Tobago to deal with this particular situation of immigration from Venezuela? I know that we have immigration. I know that we have an immigration department. I know we have customs. I know we have people coming in by plane. I know we have people coming in by boats. I know we have people coming in different parts of the what can I say, of the island that sometimes are not manned. But in addition to that, we have documented and undocumented, and we have registered and unregistered. And I want to ask the question, to what extent do we have a system, or are we moving towards or planning to have a system that would look at this migration as something from an informational point of view we need to properly not just document but systematize, and on the basis of that, within the framework of some development strategy, deploy and develop a strategy for deploying these immigrants in the country. So I would raise those three questions and simply put them out for discussion or response or comment, and I will stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. I'd like to ask Professor Gonzalez to jump in at this point to respond to Dr. Tiwari.
Yes, thank you, Christian. There are a number of interesting questions, and I think I want to thank all three commentators for providing this food for thought. The first point I wanted to respond to was that raised by Dr. Gomes. I think in the end, she raised a fundamental question, which we started to discuss some weeks ago from Richard Lynch. That is to the extent to which we have a concept of citizenship based on our history. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think she was more or less suggesting that we are a migrant society and that we should have a concept of multiculturalism that absorbs new migrants, that we should be open to new migrants and we should be sympathetic towards them and so on. I must say that I'm not sure I'm interpreting you correctly, and I always like to be sure when I'm saying something, I interpret people correctly. Now, I think that to some extent is correct, but we also have to be concerned with the fact that currently we are an English-speaking country, and that we are, over the years, we have been trying to form a society, and that creates certain problems. Just let me give you a scenario, for instance. If we get 60 to 100,000 Venezuelans here, within 10 to 15 years, they can change the nature of the society fundamentally. They can demand the Spanish language be spoken. They can demand, for instance, that the official regulations provide for the Spanish language to be used in courts and government documents, etc. I have lived in societies where language is important, where you have 2-3 languages content, and I could tell you how difficult it is to operate in that environment. And this is why, for example, the Americans have taken a position that if you want to come to America, you have to learn language. And as I said last time, 13% of the Americans are Hispanics, are Latinos, but America does not recognize Spanish as an official language. They allow it to be used in certain quarters, but it is not officially recognized. You have no basis to claim Spanish as an official language in the United States. And that is because the concept of themselves is an English-speaking country. Now, I raise this because Venezuela is not just, the Venezuelans coming in are not just 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000. They're linked to Venezuelans, 32 million Venezuelans across the main that can exercise a tremendous amount of pressure on you to do various things. So you have to also bear that in mind. And you have to think in terms of, do you want to be a Spanish-speaking country? Do you want to be an English-speaking country? How do you want to operate? These are not migrants that came here years ago, like our forefathers, who came here as slaves or indentured laborers and so forth, who had no choice of language, who had to come and learn the master's language and integrate accordingly and so on. So I'm just raising this to say to you that we have to be very careful as to how we go about assimilating Spanish-speaking people in the country, because it may fundamentally change the character of the country and the whole cultural base of the country to the extent which could create quite a bit of friction. I will leave it at there for the time being because there are a number of other things I want to quickly reply to. Roger raised the question of re-registration, and I agree with him. For instance, given another 6 months is not particularly helpful. If we want these people to stay here, plan accordingly, escape all the uncertainty that face them and so forth, we need to give them a longer horizon. Sure, maybe going beyond a year may be too much because we don't want to encourage too many of them to come at this particular point in time. We know, for instance, that if you go and do something like Colombia, or even probably if you extend it to more than 1 year, you may find that a lot more Venezuelans turning up on your borders and you may not be able to deal with that. So there is need for caution. But even within that context, I still think there's a need for going beyond the 6 months. Maybe we could have done a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. It may not have been bad because, as I agree with Roger, that we need to start thinking over the long term of how we use Venezuelan labor, because certainly Trinidad has an aging population, and we will need that labor later on. I agree with Roger about the skills point. I think we need to have a proper census as to all who is here. I saw in his survey he sent me yesterday that they claim that 30% or about a third of the Venezuelans here are skilled people, and they have a university, a third have a university degree. I was a bit surprised, but the author did remark that if you compare it with what is registered in the registration that did in 2019 by the government, you'll find that where the percentage is much less. I think in the percentages that the government recorded, it was simply about 15 to 20% that had a university degree. So there's some discrepancy there, but I'm not clear. So I'm not clear. But we do have a problem of knowing exactly what skills are there. And he's quite correct, and you see it all in Colombia and in Peru and so forth. If you are skilled and you're undocumented, if you have a degree and undocumented, doctors, lawyers, and all this sort of thing, and you're undocumented, you're going to do, you can't get proper work, you know, because nobody will accept you if you don't have a permit. So you tend to operate within the informal sector. So I think we want to encourage them to come out of that informal sector and get regularized in a particular way. Moving on quickly, he raised a point about the productivity in the agricultural sector being very, very low, and we need to encourage capital. I agree with that. Agriculture could only be developed today by modern equipment, modern technology, and we need to really pay attention to that and use the Venezuelans accordingly. I note, for example, in that same survey he sent me yesterday, that only 4% of the Venezuelans are going into agriculture, which is very small as compared to what is going into the retail business, and what is going into the hospitality industry and so forth. About 6% is going into manufacturing, according to that survey. So there's a lot of room for improvement here, but we first of all need business people to invest more in agriculture and develop it like in Holland on a technological basis, more capital into it and so forth. And this brings me to the question raised by Dr. Tawari about strategy, development strategy. Do we have the absorptive capacity? What do we need to do to integrate Venezuelans properly? I agree that we have to have a strategy of transformation that would seek to push this country into a competitive, tradable exporting economy, where we develop a whole lot of high-valued export sectors that would get us away from this oil and gas. And to do that, it requires a significant effort. We're still to see that effort coming forth. And it's in that context, I think we can use the Venezuelans effectively. I think if we manage to get that going, the Venezuelans could fit quite well into that. But it's taken us a while to get that going. And I'm not sure we would develop the absorption capacity unless we go that particular route. So I'm like him a little skeptical, but I see the need for it, and I'm trying to detect the ways in which it could probably be evolving. And I would conclude by saying that it's hard to judge how receptive Trinidadians are to Venezuelans. As yet, I have not seen any open hostility. I mean, I don't circulate that much, so it's probably difficult for me to see what's happening on the ground. I mean, I was predicting a lot of what was going to happen to the American nations some years a while back, and I now see it happening. So I tend to like to be able to spot things as they're coming down the pipeline and be able to talk about them. I haven't been able to see this with respect to the Venezuelans here. I think somehow or the other Trinidadians, even though they may be going through difficult times, they tend to be a little more tolerant, and they don't necessarily see the Venezuelans as, at this point in time, has taken away very much from them. So I'm hoping that even with the COVID thing, at one point in time, there were a lot of rumors about the Venezuelans bringing COVID here, and they started the second wave and all of that. But a lot of that talk died down. I think more or less the government handled it reasonably well, and we were able to come out of that. So I would say to Dr. Tiwari that it's very difficult to judge, but from where I stand, I do not see any kind of hostility evolving, emerging in the near term towards Venezuela here. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez. Next, I'd just like to bring Dr. Gomes into the conversation. I'd just like you to give us a cultural perspective on, for example, what is the likely impact of the Venezuelan migration on the culture of Trinidad and Tobago?
So I think that's a question we could, and a lot of us have already started to think about. We could spend a lot more time talking about and looking at what other people do. And to respond very quickly, if I could combine that question with Dr. Tiwari's on the economic viability for migrants, as well as thinking about the economic situation in the destination country, because it is both at the, as I would say, the material and the symbolic levels that we could think about these two things together. Because it is, and Trinidad and Tobago is also in the global south, quote unquote, it is also, it receives a lot of migrants, right? So it's also, because of a well-developed oil and natural gas industry, certainly over the past 100 years, migrants, immigrants in that sense are not new, right? And so, but these have also been immigrants largely from other English-speaking Caribbean countries, right? As Professor Gonzalez noted, that are not a threat to this hard-sought vision of nationhood. And so to think about those who are constructed as other, these Latinized Venezuelans who are of a different culture. I mean, certainly there's a great deal of cultural similarity within the Circum-Caribbean, right? There's a lived multiculturalism that we have that might also be excluded from these ideals of nationhood. And so to think about how certain immigrants are constructed as threatening to nations, certain immigrants are constructed as, or certain groups, I should say, are constructed as threatening to the national culture, whereas others are not, also relates to the point about their vulnerability. And so I think the lived multiculturalism, to answer your question, Christian, is something that's going to continue, right? Culture is, if we think about it from a Stuart Hall perspective, culture is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. The important question is who gets to define what is national culture? Because people live culture in varied, and certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, a very multicultural way. But then what gets put in and what gets excluded from national culture is something else. And that's something, as Professor Gonzalez has suggested, I do need to think, and I think a lot of us also need to think about a great deal more. So it's a rather incomplete answer, but in the interest of time, I will stop here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gomes. So next we'll take a question from the audience. Christopher Yo asks, what implications do these immigration developments have on the tension between Venezuela and Guyana? So I'd just like to bring Dr. Gonzalez, if you'd like to, would you be able to address that? As it falls in the realm of international relations.
Well, Christian, I would say, yes, Christian, I would say that what's taking place, I guess you're referring to the border dispute as the tensions between Venezuela and Guyana. I would say those are relatively independent of the what is happening now with migration. That's a long-standing border dispute. It has fed up now because of what is happening with the ICJ and the Venezuelan refugees to go to the ICJ, and they are concerned that the ICJ would give the territory to Guyana. So I don't see the migration problem there's any way affecting that. That is because of internal developments within Venezuela, as well as the long-standing border dispute and so forth. So that's what I would basically say about that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gonzalez. We have another question here from Stephanie Fingal, and then we have a question from a Mr. Wayne Calendar. So I'll read Ms. Fingal's question. She said, in speaking with at least 2 employers, it appears that a number of migrants did not get registered as offered by the government of Trinidad and Tobago and relied upon their Living Waters community card as a form of authorization to seek work. So she's asking if anyone would be able to shed light on that. Dr. Tiwari, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, Christian, if you could allow me, I can make a comment on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know really, so let somebody else speak.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
So, some people, so those people are not formally documented. They come into Trinidad, Living Waters have an almost NGO-like status in terms of registering them, so they have some basic knowledge that these people are here, but that is not the formal process. These people are largely therefore undocumented. If the police were to stop them on the streets and say, where is your Ministry of National Security registration letter or registration ID from the government of Trinidad and Tobago, they will not be able to produce it. So, in fact, if somebody comes to Trinidad and Tobago now, I understand that a boat came in last night. Some of them will go in Monday morning, buy Living Waters, and they would get the Living Waters process going. They will get a card, but they are still undocumented migrants by all means. So I hope that answers the person that asks, but to the best of my knowledge from interacting with about 85 migrants in different focus group sessions, that's what I gathered.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. One more question for you, again from Ms. Fingal. She asks, do we know which other country, or in which other country have migrant workers contributed significantly to exports?
I would imagine in Canada, via the apple picking program. I would imagine in parts of USA, they play a major part in the poultry industry. And even in different ways, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, although people came here as indentured laborers, for example, they played a tremendous role in the sugarcane industry. All of us, you and me, in the past, our ancestors played tremendous role in the main export cash crop. Now, in Ireland, the migrants are playing an important role. In Korea, they played an important role. And those are the 2 I picked up. Like Professor Gonzalez, I'm scanning the literature everywhere I could. Those are the 2, other than the standard same old that I picked up.
Yeah, could I add something to that?
Yes, Dr. Tiwari.
As you know, Canada has a very organized immigration system. And they also have a national policy of multiculturalism. And for years, that strategy of managed migration based on very, very clear criteria, a process of integration that was very well organized, and that policy of multiculturalism worked together to help them to develop two things. One was international trade capacity for export of goods and services and linked to investment. And the second thing was foreign policy in terms of how you created the conditions for facilitating foreign policy warmth on the basis of your immigrant population that felt pretty well integrated in Canada, that acknowledged the value of multiculturalism to them. And therefore, these things work for Canada as part of national strategy. They continue to work for them. And that includes, by the way, for several decades now, a strategy having to do with China. At a time when 20 or 30 years ago, China was only on the horizon as a country that would become a dominant player of the kind that it is now. And I think that the immigration policy and the supporting framework for immigration policy was really part of Canada's international trade, international investment, and global strategy from a foreign policy perspective. So I just add that.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Tiwari. So everyone, what we're going to do now, I'm going to invite each of our panelists to give closing comments. But before we do that, I want to take two questions that I would like our panelists to address in their closing comments. The first, I'd just like to invite Mr. Calendar to ask his question, and then I will read another question from a Mr. Golikeri. So Mr. Calendar, if you'd ask your question.
Okay, let me, are you hearing me? I'm just
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, I listened to the contribution from Dr. Gonzalez and also the comments by Dr. Hussein. With Dr. Gonzalez, he's talking about the impact that the 60,000 or even let's say 100,000 migrants could have on the country to change it, a sort of a fear that will change it from an English-speaking country. And then he mentioned the fact that we have also 32 million Venezuelan next door. But the English-speaking Caribbean islands, and we're talking about what, 5, 6, 7 million people in the Caribbean basin. In the Caribbean basin states, we have over 75 million non-English speaking people in other countries, all on the coastal parts of Colombia, everywhere. And I'm wondering, when are we going to make that transformation so that we could become bi or trilingual? Because you travel to places like Curacao, everybody speaks 4 or 5 different languages. All right. When we go to Caracas, we communicate by shouting because we don't know the language, and that now is a problem for us. Now the 60,000 or 100,000 Venezuelans who are there, right? Now I'm not in Trinidad. I'm a migrant myself abroad. There's no sort of analysis that tells you, all right, of the 60,000, we have so many of working, how many children, because some of them are families that came. So if you want to get these people into the labor force, you have to talk about schooling and childcare and all these sort of things, which probably don't exist even for Trinidad in sufficient amount, for the Trinidadian workers. And we also have, and I want to lay on top of that, this call by Dr. Hussein that we're missing, he seems to think that we're missing this factor boost opportunity. And I'm saying, well, what are we talking about? The fact of relying on the Venezuelan to provide this factor boost. We have Guyanese inside the country. We have Grenadians, Vincentians, Dominicans, people from all over the Caribbean, right? As I said, a large migratory sector of the workforce from other islands and from other territories. And what is needed is action to divert the use of capital, because the capital in the country, we spent $868 million in 2019 importing food. When I come to Trinidad, if I come around Wimbledon time, you could go and get strawberry and cream in Hilo. I see stuff on the shelves that costs the same as if I walk into my store here in London. So if you want to divert capital, you should make it unattractive for that sort of import. People are importing milk. Try triple filtered milk from the States, which costs $2 and sell for $56 in Trinidad in all these little boutique supermarkets. So when are we going to deal with that problem and make it attractive or unattractive for the capital to go down those sectors of import and sell? Because that is what the business community in Trinidad does well. It's very low risk. They import, and it's cheap, and they sell there. What we need to make agriculture, I say, more enticing or attractive for investment, because the low output that Dr. Hussein is talking about, it could be all sorts of reasons. It could be the nature of the tenureship of the land. You have possibly lack of mechanization and technology, as Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, in agriculture. So that's what we should be addressing. Those are the things that we should be addressing. And I know I'll be pressed for time. It's 12:30 here, but I'm up. I'd like to get some response.
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Kanda. We have one more question I'm going to ask, and I'll just allow everyone to make their closing remarks. So the question is, what is the panel's view on the efficacy of economic sanctions? Are there unintended consequences? And do they exacerbate the situation, and are they counterproductive? So I believe this question is in relation to the US sanctions in Venezuela. So I'd like to ask Dr. Tiwari to begin by giving his closing remarks. Dr. Tiwari, your closing thoughts.
Yeah. Well, economic sanctions do work, which is why they are used. Economic sanctions do work, which is why they are used, but they do not work in the long run in the way that they are intended. And that is why those sanctions have been revisited. And instead of imposing sanctions on a particular country, which ultimately brings economic hardship on the mass of the population, sanctions have been used to put pressure on individuals or a small oligarchy or basically a group of jefes in a society. So, sanctions have mixed responses. But I think in our region, given the situation in Venezuela, and given what the migration issues are creating in the region, and given the impact that it is having on all countries to which immigrants from Venezuela go, but especially on us, because you have such a large exit of Venezuelans from Venezuela, approaching 6 million now. And you have such a small population relatively from Trinidad and Tobago and in most of the other islands. And you really have a situation that has to be managed here. And the question is, we can talk about the migration and we could talk about the absorption, the integration and all of these things. But really, how do you create the conditions in which you can have what you might call relative peace and stability in the region? And that is the problem. Because the two, I think the thing that most people are probably agreed upon, and I'm saying this cautiously because I don't know if people are agreed on this, but I think the majority of people think about it in this way. I don't think anybody wants to see a military solution to the problems or issues in Venezuela. But I also think that people also do not want the Maduro regime to continue in the way that they are continuing, to see the migration escalate and approach 7 million, 8 million, etc., with the attendant problems that they are going to cause. And therefore, this issue has to come to resolution, even as we seek to manage what you might term the immigration problem from the fallout from economic disaster and political repression in Venezuela. And I think that is the ultimate question that we have to begin to wrestle with. And I think that the hemisphere, as a hemisphere, has to begin to address this opportunity which has emerged because you have a new administration in the United States. Perhaps there would be no major shift in policy, that is true, but you are unlikely to see the belligerence in this administration that we would have associated with the Trump administration before. So I think this thing requires some kind of hemispheric intervention and movement to make a resolution possible. It may take other actors from across the world as well because of the international relations strategy of Venezuela to involve countries as diverse as Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, Cuba, etc. in their internal affairs and playing important military, political, and economic roles inside the country. But the issue, a resolution has to be found for the issue so that there can be relative stability in terms of the migration question, first of all, for Trinidad and Tobago, relative stability in terms of the management of the immigration issue in the various countries in the Americas, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. And so that we can focus on other things post-vaccination, like economic recoup and recovery, and really strategies for development for a world that is in transformation. I mean, the irony of our situation in the world post-COVID is that we are now exploring Mars, and artificial intelligence is driving all the technology of competitiveness. And we basically are also dealing with a world in which 1 billion people are living in poverty, and which the inequities in the world population and in the world system have become glaring because of the COVID pandemic. So I think we have, bigger fish to fry in this thing, and really the survival of middle-income states like Trinidad and Tobago is critical. We are on a regression path. And I don't know to what extent under current circumstances and with current thinking, we are going to be able to get out of that. So those are some of the issues that I'm concerned about, and therefore I close with those.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Hussein. Dr. Hussein.
Christian, Dr. Hussein is having some technical difficulties, so you can move on.
Yeah, I got you. So,
Okay, great.
I would have liked a bit more time to respond to Wayne, but what I would say is that whether or not we wish to pause to discuss the amount of Venezuelans here, it's not going to change the number. Yes, we have Grenadians here. I don't know of much Guyanese here, and I certainly don't expect any Guyanese to remain here in the next 5 years. In fact, I expect just the opposite. I expect a massive amount of people to flow into Guyana because of the substantive wealth that country will now accrue. It's going to be enormous. And we have these people here. You see, this is not a debate about whether or not the Venezuelans are here in Trinidad. Technically, we have close to 60,000 Venezuelans here, and the challenge before us is how do we use this factor boom? Now, I have read about the first factor boom, which is in the period 1973 to 1982. And from what I read, it was a bad experience in terms of the way we use the resource wealth. I was a functioning economist in this second factor boom from 1999 to 2015. And I am flabbergasted when I stand in front of my classroom. I feel, I sometimes I'm at loss for words to explain where the 54 billion US in energy rents went. And I feel scared that they may ask me, so, and I'm putting it in layman's term, well, a big educated man like you sit in the university and see them waste all this money? And I feel scared because I will speak as much as I want. I will speak often, but no one will listen. The money is all gone. No matter what we say, Wayne, that 53 billion is all gone. And on top of that, for good measure, we have $130 billion TT in debt. So just to backtrack to your specific comment about the Venezuelans, they are here. And the challenge before us is how to integrate and systematically use them in a way that could benefit them from a humanitarian perspective, but also us, because we have a rapidly depleting stock of foreign exchange. And so the interaction and integration must have an element of win-win in it. It must, of course, have the humanitarian aspect, and it must, of course, have an economic aspect. But there should be, in my understanding, a win-win aspect, and that's where I see the agriculture playing a role, except to the extent, and you raised quite a few of the issues, that output per worker is very low in the agricultural sector. So, given the issues that will cause it to be low, how do we now change some of those things so that output per worker can rise and that the Venezuelans do not predominate in the informal part of the non-tradable sector with all kind of non-energy current account balance implications. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Dr. Hussein. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Gomes to give her closing remarks.
Thanks, Christian. I don't have any closing remarks except to say, because I know everybody must be hungry and tired. Well, except Wayne, because I know it's midday. But I would like to give credit to the student who has done the bulk of the work. And I know this is being recorded. I don't know if he would like me to say his name, but what I would like to do is put the link for our short piece. It's a short piece to the Sociological Review blog, if I can put it in the chat. And also, so you could circulate it, and also to highlight an NGO that he is going to start. He has actually already registered it. Okay, great, thanks. the League for the Improvement of Families in Trinidad and Tobago. So I'll also put that as well, because he, with his partner, have been doing also work, more community-centered work with migrants in South Trinidad. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution tonight, Dr. Gomes. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Gonzalez to give his closing remarks.
Yes, Christian, well, first of all, let me tell Win how glad I am to hear from him. I think I've lost touch with him for probably over 20 or 30 years. He was at the Institute years ago. But anyway, we'll find another way to get in touch. You raised the point about use of Spanish and being surrounded by Spanish-speaking countries, 75 million Spanish-speaking people around us. Let me say that the Spanish-speaking people learn English, but they do not change the character of their society. They still remain Spanish-speaking. So that the fact that you can learn a foreign language and have a second language doesn't mean that you necessarily change the linguistic nature of your society. So, you know, I think that we have created an English-speaking society here, our own vernacular, of course, and to some extent, we would like to keep it that way. The traditions, values, and mores, and the whole culture that we have built here and that we are building here, which we would like to, in a way, to remain in charge of. And to some extent, we, as far as I can detect, I think we won't like it to be subverted by people who are not part of that culture making. We would like them to come into the culture and become Trinidadian, like we do when we migrate to other countries. We become American, we become English, we become all sorts of things. So that is, in that sense, I'm referring to that. Not that we shouldn't learn Spanish. Of course, we should learn Spanish, and everybody should learn Spanish and learn to speak Spanish. But we want to remain an English-speaking society. We have to be very careful that we don't lose that, because that could easily happen to us. The other point about sanctions, I think we have to begin to take a second look at these sanctions. Sanctions work in some circumstances, and other circumstances they do not work. I'm not sure to what extent the regime in Venezuela is getting around sanctions. I think I saw in an American document where they felt that the government there was able to circumvent the sanctions and sell oil on the international market. But I still think the sanctions are biting. They are affecting the ability of the country to attract investment and to export and so forth. And that is something we need to look at. I feel that if after 3 years you cannot remove the regime, then you have to take a slightly different approach. What happens in these circumstances is that a nationalist government, and let me say that my understanding of the Venezuelan situation is that Venezuela has had a revolution where a whole new group of people who had never had power before has taken power, and they're not prepared to give it up easily. They've entrenched themselves and they've dug in themselves militarily very strong and politically very strong, and it's very difficult to move them. The United States cannot move them militarily. The rest of the neighbors, Brazil and Colombia and so forth, cannot move them. So that, in a sense, one has to play for the long term and try to see how you could bring that regime around. And the regime, in my view, is capable of moving. For instance, we already see where they're moving towards privatization. They're privatizing a number of companies. They've also introduced the US dollar as the currency. So that the regime is, to some extent, accepts certain realities and they may be moving. I think what happened over the years, starting back from Chavez, the reaction to them was too strong, and there were attempts to overthrow the government. There were attempts to overthrow Chavez from 2002, and since then things just went haywire. And we don't seem to want to recognize that this is a nationalist regime that wants to keep Venezuelans for Venezuelans. They want to keep the oil to themselves and to be in charge of it, and they don't want outsiders coming to tell them what to do. And we in a sense have to deal with that. Now, what is happening is because of the sanctions to some extent, there's a humanitarian crisis. basically Venezuelans move because of food and medicines. As simple as that. There's no food, there's no medicine, so people move. If you give them food and you give them medicine, they will stay in Venezuela. Venezuelans don't come here because of human rights problems. It's not like in some countries running from conflict where people are running because of all types of human rights violations and political persecution. Venezuelans come and they come and they go back. They're sort of like circular migrants, and it's largely because there's no food and there's no medicine. That's the bottom line. So my feeling is that one has to approach this in a more humanitarian way, and I feel that the Western countries, in particular the United States, and Biden himself has spoken about this, I hope he will do something about it. They should start increasing the amount of assistance to Venezuela. Venezuela gets 1/10 of the assistance that was given to Syria, although the migration is more or less the same at the same level. So that the Western countries have to step up the humanitarian assistance and try to see to what extent they can alleviate this migration problem. Once you deal with the migration problem and Venezuelans decide to stay at home, we could then deal with the regime and see over time how we solve this. But to brutally impose some of these sanctions would have a tremendous cost on the people. I think the UN Special Rapporteur did a study, it's out here some months, showing directly the amount of people who suffer from malnutrition as a result of the sanctions, the amounts who died from lack of medicine as a result of the country not being able to buy medicine. It's detail all the number of deaths resulting from these sanctions. So the UN Special Rapporteur called for an easing of the sanctions. So I tend to believe that there's something about removing the sanctions, we can do it. And I tend to feel that if we look around and we see the Nicaraguan regime is still there, the Cuban regime is still there since 1959, we haven't been able to get rid of that. So let us be realistic and try and deal with the Venezuelan regime. So that is what I would say about sanctions. I think Wayne raised another question, but I don't think I remember it at this point in time, something about the economy, but I think more or less I was in agreement with it. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Professor Gonzalez. To our entire panel, we just want to thank you very much for taking the time to spend with us this evening to answer questions and to address the impact of the Venezuelan migration on Trinidad and Tobago. So, and lastly, to our audience, thank you for taking the time to join us, in particular, Mr. Calendar, who stayed up well past midnight so he could be with us and contribute.
Yes.
And with that, everybody, we would like to close. Thank you. Thanks again for coming out, everyone. Just to clarify, the chat is saved, so we'll make sure to keep the questions and make sure to connect you, Mr. Calendar, with Professor Gonzalez. Okay?
Yeah, I've sent my contact details on for WhatsApp.
Yes.
So just have to update your contact detail, and I'm always available.
Okay.
But
Thanks very much.
I think what we need to look at also is the opportunity that presents itself to us as a economy right off of Venezuela. You have 32 million people there who, as you say, need food and medicine. We have productive capacity in manufacturing operating at suboptimal levels, sometimes 40% output. We want to run factories 8 to 4, right? That factor boost could be running those factories 24 hours and so on, and exporting to Venezuela and the rest of Latin America. So,
thank you very much, Mr. Calendar.
Okay.
Appreciate your contribution.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much and do have a good night.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, all the best. Yes.